Varric had seen many things in his years as a diplomat, but nothing quite like this. The journey had been grueling, the mission delicate, but the stakes had never been higher. The kingdom was on the brink of war, and it was his responsibility to avert it. The key to peace lay in the Beastkin tribes, fierce and untamable creatures who controlled vast swathes of land and resources that were vital to both human kingdoms. Lord Varric had been sent to secure an alliance with them, but as he made his way through the dense, mist-laden forests to their stronghold, his confidence faltered. The air around him hummed with an unnatural energy, and he could feel the weight of ancient eyes watching his every move. His soldiers were uneasy, even though the presence of the Beastkin was still some miles off. It was clear that these lands were sacred to the creatures, steeped in customs and traditions as old as the earth itself. None of this had been in his mission briefing. All he had been told was to negotiate peace, and if it wasn't possible, he was to offer them whatever they desired, within reason, of course. The first sight of the Beastkin tribe's capital was nothing short of imposing. Towering stone spires jutted up from the earth like the bones of long-dead giants, and the air smelled of earth, fire, and something wild. As they entered the gates, the silence was oppressive. No chatter, no sounds of everyday life, just the unsettling stillness that came with the knowledge that this place held secrets, and its people were not quick to trust outsiders. Varric had been briefed on their customs, of course, though the delicate nature of this mission meant that he could not rely solely on the rules written on paper. The Beastkin had their own culture, their own laws, and their own sense of honor. What they considered a token of goodwill might be seen as an insult to humans, and vice versa. But Lord Varric had handled delicate situations before. If anyone could manage the minefield of politics and tradition, it was him. But nothing could have prepared him for her. Kayla, the leader of the tribe, and the one Varric had been sent to meet. She was as feared as she was revered, a woman whose presence alone could silence a room. Standing at over 6 feet tall, her golden fur shimmered in the low light, and her cat-like eyes glowed with a fierce intelligence. Her body was that of a warrior, muscular and strong, but graceful in a way that made her seem almost predatory. The way she moved, with the slightest hint of a feline grace, left no doubt that she was someone to be reckoned with. The moment she stepped into the room, Varric's breath caught, her gaze fixed on him with a penetrating intensity that made his stomach tighten. She was as much of a mystery as the land itself, and yet Varric could feel something stirring beneath the surface of her controlled demeanor. He didn't know whether it was fear or something more instinctual, but he had never been one to show weakness. He met her gaze with his own, steady and unwavering, trying to suppress the thrill that ran through him. The meeting was tense as expected. Varric presented his case for peace, carefully outlining the terms that he believed would benefit both sides. He spoke with the authority of a man who had spent his life negotiating, but he could tell that Kayla wasn't listening in the same way. Her attention wasn't on the terms, no, it was on him. She watched his every move, her eyes never straying from his face. It was difficult to concentrate under her gaze. Something about the way she observed him, calm, predatory, yet almost curious, set his nerves alight. He shifted in his seat, trying not to let his discomfort show. "You speak of peace," Kayla said, her voice low and rich like velvet. "But what is it that you truly want, Lord Varric? Your people have never respected us. Not truly. Why should we believe that this alliance is anything more than a pretext for your kingdoms to exploit our resources?" Her words stung, but Varric held his ground. "I am here to avoid a war, Kayla," he said, his tone steady. "I am offering something more than resources. I am offering an understanding, a partnership, so that both our people can thrive." For a moment, the room was silent. Varric couldn't tell whether she was considering his words or measuring him in some way he didn't fully understand. She leaned forward slightly, and he couldn't help but notice the delicate curve of her neck, the way her muscles flexed with the smallest of movements. She was a force of nature, and there was something about her, something that made him uneasy and intrigued at the same time. Then, without warning, she stood up and moved toward him. Her steps were deliberate, and each one seemed to vibrate through the room with the weight of her power. Varric didn't move, his pulse quickening. She stopped just a few feet away, her eyes never leaving his. The tension in the air was suffocating, but what happened next was entirely unexpected. Kayla reached out and placed her hand on his, her fingers brushing against the back of his hand in a gesture that seemed casual, but he could feel the electric charge between them. His breath caught in his throat as her skin touched his. There was something ancient in the contact, something primal, and his mind struggled to understand what it meant. "What are you doing?" Varric asked, his voice strained. Her lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "A test," she said softly, her eyes gleaming. "You are unaware of the significance, aren't you?" Before Varric could respond, a sudden wave of energy pulsed between them, like a current surging through his veins. His heart raced as the sensation seemed to consume him, leaving him breathless and dazed. Kayla's eyes widened, her expression changing from one of calm confidence to something more intense, more knowing. "You've triggered the bond," she whispered, more to herself than to him. The words didn't make sense at first, and then they did. It was an ancient custom of the beastkin. A touch, a simple, accidental touch, could create an unbreakable bond between a human and a beastkin, and that bond could lead to only two things: marriage or pregnancy. Varric's mind spun. He had no idea what he had just stepped into, but there was no turning back now. Varric's heart pounded in his chest as Kayla stepped back, her hand lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. The room seemed to close in around him, the weight of her touch lingering like a phantom. The bond. She had spoken of it as though it were something unavoidable, and by the looks in her eyes, it was clear that she wasn't simply playing games. Something had happened, something deep and ancient that neither of them could ignore. "Explain," Varric said, trying to maintain some semblance of control. His voice was steadier than he felt, but there was a sharpness in his words. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Kayla's expression softened, but only slightly. The warmth in her gaze was still laced with an unspoken challenge, as if she were daring him to accept the consequences of his actions. "The bond is formed by touch," she said slowly, her voice low, almost reverent. "When a human comes into contact with a beastkin in this way, unintentionally or not, it is recognized by our people as a sacred bond. It can only lead to two things: marriage or progeny." Varric's stomach twisted as he tried to digest what she was saying. "Marriage?" he repeated, his mind reeling. This is absurd. I didn't. There was no intent behind it." She met his gaze squarely, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Intent does not matter. The bond does not care for your intentions. What matters now is that it exists, and it has already begun to weave between us." Varric swallowed hard, his mind racing through the implications. He had heard of the beastkin's customs, of course, had studied them in preparation for this mission, but he never imagined he would find himself caught in one of them so quickly, and certainly not by accident. The whole purpose of this mission was peace, and now his role in it had been irrevocably complicated by a cultural misunderstanding. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "I came here to negotiate, not to be trapped in some kind of primitive ceremony." Kayla's lips curved into a faint, almost mocking smile. "You are not trapped, Lord Varric. You simply do not understand what you've done. You touched me and the bond was formed. That is the reality now. It is not something we can undo, no matter how much you wish otherwise." Varric's frustration bubbled to the surface, but he quickly suppressed it. "So what now?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Do I just marry you? Is that the only solution?" Kayla's smile faded, and she turned her gaze to the floor for a moment, as though weighing something deep in her mind. "Marriage is the most common outcome," she said. "It is the way of my people. It cements the bond between human and beastkin. If you refuse that, the alternative is less conventional." Varric felt a chill run down his spine at the unspoken words between them. He didn't need her to elaborate to understand what she meant. He could already feel the weight of her words, the pressure of an expectation that neither of them could avoid. The bond had already begun to tie them together, and he knew that Kayla wasn't going to let him walk away without honoring it in some way. I can't just marry you, Kayla, he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and determination. I have responsibilities, duties to my kingdom. This, this is beyond anything I could have imagined. She took a step closer to him, her presence overwhelming in the silence. Varric could feel the heat radiating from her body as she moved, though she did not touch him. You do not have to marry me immediately, she said, her voice still cool, though there was a softness to it that hadn't been there before. But you must honor the bond. It is the only way for both our people to avoid conflict. Varric's mind spun. A marriage, he could not fathom it. He had come here to negotiate an alliance to keep the peace. He couldn't allow himself to be sidetracked by something so personal, so intimate. Kayla's eyes softened slightly, and she seemed to recognize the turmoil in his expression. I understand that this is difficult for you, she said, her voice gentle in contrast to the strength that lay beneath it. But the bond is not something we can ignore. It is not just a symbol, it is a part of who we are. To break it would be to dishonor everything my people stand for. We would be at war. Varric's stomach tightened at the weight of her words. He knew she spoke the truth, but the idea of being bound to her, of being dragged into a union he didn't want, unsettled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His mind raced with possible solutions, but nothing seemed to offer a way out. I'll need time to think, he said, his voice hoarse as he turned away from her, pacing across the room. He needed to regain some semblance of control over the situation. He had to think of a way to preserve both his mission and his honor, without being pulled into a political and emotional minefield. Kayla remained silent, her eyes following his every movement. She understood the complexity of the situation better than he did, but she wasn't in the habit of giving up control. She knew that her people were watching, waiting for the outcome of this unspoken negotiation, and she had to ensure that whatever decision was made would not fracture the fragile peace they had maintained for so long. As the minutes passed in tense silence, Varric finally turned back to face her, his expression resolute. I need to return to my people. I'll inform them of what has happened. Then we will figure out how to proceed. Kayla nodded slowly, but her eyes remained intense. I will respect your wishes, but know this, Lord Varric. Time is not on your side. The longer you delay, the more difficult it will be to honor the bond, and our people will not wait forever. Varric met her gaze, the weight of her words sinking in. He knew she was right. Every moment spent negotiating with her, avoiding the reality of their situation, was a moment closer to a breaking point. He had no choice but to act quickly. As he turned to leave, his mind churned with possibilities, none of which felt like a viable escape. The room seemed to close in on him again, and the air was thick with the tension of something far larger than himself, something he had no control over. Lord Varric, Kayla's voice called after him, and he paused, turning back. Her eyes were steady, but there was something different in them now, something more vulnerable. Whatever happens next, she said, her voice quiet but firm, know that I will honor this bond, even if you cannot. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. The pressure of their unspoken connection was becoming too much to bear, but there was no turning back now. The future of their people, and perhaps his own heart, was tied to this moment. I'll keep that in mind, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, before turning and walking out into the uncertain night ahead. The days that followed were filled with a tension that seemed to hang in the air like a storm, waiting to break. Varric's mind raced as he tried to make sense of the situation. The bond, the touch. It had been so sudden, so unexpected. He could still feel the echo of Kayla's fingers against his skin, the electricity that had surged through him when their hands met. It was as though something had awakened inside him, something primal that he couldn't ignore. He had returned to his quarters, his mind restless and unsettled, but there was little time to think. Kayla's words had weighed heavily on him, and he knew he had to act quickly. He couldn't allow himself to be trapped in this situation. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, his thoughts kept circling back to her. The way she stood before him, so powerful and so unyielding, the way her gaze had lingered on him with an intensity that left him both shaken and intrigued. Varric had always prided himself on his ability to stay in control. He was a diplomat, a man who had negotiated countless treaties, who had faced down kings and generals without batting an eye. But this was different. Kayla was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her strength, her confidence, the way she moved through the world with an undeniable grace, it was mesmerizing. And now, it seemed as though fate had bound him to her in a way he couldn't escape. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He turned sharply, his body tensing in reflex before he forced himself to relax. "Enter," he called, his voice steady, though the tension in his chest had not eased. The door opened, and a messenger stepped inside. The young man bowed low, his eyes darting nervously to Varric before he spoke. "Lord Varric, there is word from the tribe. Lady Kayla requests your presence immediately. She insists that it is urgent." Varric's stomach twisted. He had hoped for a reprieve, some time to gather his thoughts, but Kayla's summons couldn't be ignored. He had to go to her. There was no other choice. "Thank you," Varric said, his voice controlled despite the turmoil inside. "I will be there shortly." The messenger left, and Varric stood from his desk, moving toward the door. He adjusted his cloak and took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever awaited him. The bond was not something he could dismiss, and the longer he waited, the more it seemed to tighten around him. The need to address it one way or another was becoming unavoidable. The walk to Kayla's chambers was silent, and with each step, the tension in the air seemed to grow heavier. The castle was eerily quiet, as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. As he reached her door, Varric paused, taking a moment to collect himself. The last time he had seen Kayla, her presence had been commanding, her every word charged with authority. He knew that their next meeting would not be any easier. He knocked, and the door opened almost immediately, revealing Kayla standing in the doorway. Her golden eyes met his, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other. There was an undeniable pull between them, a magnetic force that neither of them seemed able to resist. She didn't speak at first, and Varric found himself at a loss for words as well. The weight of what had happened between them hung in the air, and neither of them seemed eager to address it directly. Kayla stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come in, Lord Varric. We have much to discuss." Varric entered her chambers, his senses immediately assaulted by the heady mixture of incense and the earthy scent of the forest that seemed to cling to her. The room was dimly lit, and the large windows opened up to reveal a breathtaking view of the forest beyond, its trees swaying gently in the wind. Kayla's home was a reflection of her, beautiful, wild, and untamed. She closed the door behind him, her movements smooth and graceful. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, her voice low and steady. There was no anger in her tone, only a quiet understanding. Varric turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "I've been busy," he said, his voice guarded. "There are many things I need to consider before making any decisions." Kayla nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand, but there are matters that can't wait. The bond is already affecting both of us, whether we acknowledge it or not. Our people are watching, waiting for us to act. The longer we delay, the more complicated things will become." Varric's pulse quickened at her words. She was right. Time was running out. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the situation closing in on him. But the idea of being bound to her, of marrying her, or worse, being forced into a union that was not of his choosing, was something he couldn't fathom. "I'm not ready to make that decision," he said, his voice tight. "I need more time to think. This isn't something that can be rushed." Kayla's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm not asking you to rush, Lord Varric. I'm asking you to understand the reality of the situation. The bond exists and it will not fade. You cannot ignore it forever." Varric met her gaze, his chest tightening at the intensity in her eyes. There was no escaping her words. The bond was real, and it was pulling them together in ways neither of them could control. He wanted to fight it, to find a way out, but he knew deep down that there was no easy solution. Why me? He asked quietly, the question slipping from his lips before he could stop it. Why did it have to be me? Kayla's expression shifted, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something softer in her eyes, something vulnerable. The bond is not about you, Lord Varric, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It is about what we can create together, what our people need. We are the key to peace, and the bond is a part of that. Varric opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His mind was a blur of conflicting emotions. The weight of his duty, the pressure of the bond, and the undeniable pull he felt toward Kayla all seemed to collide within him. He had never felt so lost, so out of control. Lord Varric, Kayla said, her voice a little stronger now. The longer you wait, the more difficult it will be for both of us. The bond is only the beginning. You must decide how far you're willing to go to see this through. The finality in her words hung in the air like a challenge. Varric felt the tension building between them, the unspoken promise of something far more complicated than either of them had anticipated. He had come here with a mission, but now he found himself trapped in a much deeper struggle, one that would change everything. Kayla's gaze remained steady as she waited for his response, but Varric knew one thing for certain. The path ahead was uncertain, and no matter what decision he made, there would be no turning back. Varric stood frozen, the weight of Kayla's words pressing on him like a heavy cloak. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, to push back against the invisible force that was pulling him into this impossible situation. But no words came. He couldn't escape the gravity of the moment, the sense that the bond between them was growing stronger, not weaker, with each passing second. Kayla studied him intently, her golden eyes unwavering. It was as if she were waiting for him to make some grand decision, to either accept or reject the path laid before them. The bond was not something that could be undone, and they both knew it. There were only two paths forward, marriage or progeny. The idea of both choices felt like an overwhelming weight on Varric's shoulders, but he couldn't deny that there was a certain undeniable pull toward her, a pull he hadn't expected nor wanted. He finally broke the silence, his voice rough, as if it had to claw its way out of his chest. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. You and I, we're from different worlds. Kayla's lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes softened. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But that doesn't change what's happening. This bond, it transcends our worlds. It's a part of who we are, Varric. It always has been. The use of his name sent a shiver down his spine. He hadn't realized how powerful it could sound coming from her lips, soft, yet laced with authority. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone who had become a fixture in his thoughts, someone he couldn't ignore, and that frightened him more than anything else. Varric took a step back, trying to distance himself from the weight of her gaze, but the room seemed to close in on him. The walls, the air, even the floor beneath his feet felt heavy with the charge between them. It was suffocating, yet it felt impossible to escape. I don't know what you expect from me, he said, his voice still tight. You say we're bound together, but I don't see how that's possible. I'm a diplomat, Kayla. I'm here to represent my people, not to become entangled in some ritual or politics that I don't understand. Kayla stepped closer, her presence overwhelming, her body a silhouette against the soft light filtering in through the window. You may not understand it now, she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. But in time you will. The bond isn't just about politics. It's about survival. It's about our people, and what we can offer one another. Varric clenched his fists, his mind racing as he tried to keep control of his thoughts. Her words, though true in their own right, didn't ease the anxiety swirling in his gut. He wanted to push her away, to dismiss the idea of the bond altogether. But something in him, the same force that had drawn them together in the first place, was reluctant to do so. Survival, Varric echoed, though the word tasted bitter on his tongue. By what? Bonding? Having children? You think that's the only way? Kayla's eyes hardened slightly, but she didn't step back. She was resolute, unwavering. The bond is the way. Without it, our people will continue to fight among themselves. Our leaders will fracture, and war will be inevitable. This bond is more than just a connection between you and me. It's the key to uniting our people, to creating something stronger than either of us could alone. The weight of her words settled on Varric's shoulders like a mantle. He could feel the truth in them, the undeniable logic that the bond, however strange, was perhaps the only way to prevent something far worse. But it still didn't feel right. His body, his heart, his mind, none of them were ready for what she was suggesting. To bind himself to her, to commit in a way he didn't fully understand, it was terrifying. Then what do you expect me to do? Varric asked, his voice rough as he fought to maintain his composure. I can't just agree to this. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. This wasn't part of the deal. Kayla's expression softened once more, but this time, there was something more in her eyes. A deep sadness, as if she understood the burden she was asking him to bear. I don't expect you to decide right away, she said gently, but I can't promise you that there will be time for much longer. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will be for us both. The bond will only grow stronger, and the pressure on both of us will increase. Varric's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He couldn't deny the pull between them, the strange connection that had begun the moment their skin had touched. The warmth of her hand, the intensity of her eyes. It was something he couldn't easily dismiss. Yet the idea of giving in to it, of surrendering himself to a fate he hadn't chosen, terrified him. Please, just give me some time, he said, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. He didn't know why he said it, but the plea seemed to hang in the air between them. I need to think. I need to understand what this really means. Kayla was silent for a moment, studying him as though weighing his words. Finally, she nodded, though the movement was slow, almost reluctant. I will give you time, she said, her voice soft. But there was a new edge to it, something that hinted at the growing urgency of the situation. But know this, Varric. Time is not a luxury we have. The bond is already here, and soon we will have to face it. Her words lingered in the air, their weight settling heavily between them. Varric could feel the tension stretching, a taut wire pulled so tight it might snap at any moment. He wanted to leave, to retreat to a place where he could think clearly, but Kayla's presence seemed to fill the room, drawing him back to her. He had to get control of the situation. He had to make a decision. I'll be back tomorrow, Varric said, turning toward the door. His voice was firm even if his mind wasn't. I'll figure this out. Kayla didn't stop him, but her gaze followed him as he walked toward the door. Her silence was more telling than anything she could have said. He wasn't sure what had changed between them, but something had. Something that made the stakes feel higher, the consequences more dire. As Varric stepped into the corridor, he felt the weight of her gaze on his back, the unspoken words hanging in the air. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. The path ahead was becoming more tangled by the moment, and soon he would have to choose a direction. The next day passed in a blur. Varric couldn't focus on anything, his thoughts constantly returning to Kayla, to the bond between them that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. No matter how hard he tried to push the thoughts aside, they lingered at the edge of his consciousness. He had never been a man to act impulsively, but this situation felt like one he couldn't control, no matter how many strategies he tried to come up with. By the time evening arrived, the weight of the decision he had to make seemed unbearable. He couldn't delay any longer. Kayla had been patient, but even she had made it clear that their time was running out. The pressure to make a choice was relentless. Varric found himself standing at the door to her chambers once again, his hand hovering over the door handle as his mind raced. He hadn't even realized how much he was dreading this moment until now. Every part of him wanted to turn away, to flee from the inevitable. But something deeper than logic was pulling him forward, urging him to face this head-on. The bond, their connection, it was real, and no amount of denial could change that. With a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Kayla answered almost immediately. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an undeniable tension in her posture, as though she too was bracing for what came next. She stepped aside, allowing him to enter, but her gaze lingered on him as if waiting for him to say something first. Varric paused in the center of the room, feeling the intensity of her presence like a tangible force. The air was thick with unspoken words. He could hear his heart pounding in his ears as he tried to form the words he needed. "I've thought about it," he said, his voice steady but with an underlying tension. "I know I can't avoid this. I know that the bond is something we can't escape. But I still don't understand it completely. I don't know what it means for us." Kayla's gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something darker behind her eyes. She stepped toward him, her movements graceful, but there was a quiet intensity in the way she moved, a power that seemed to hum in the air around her. She stopped just inches away, her gaze never leaving his. "Do you want to understand?" she asked, her voice low, almost a challenge. "Do you want to know what it means to be bound to me?" Varric's breath caught in his throat. There was something in her words, something in the way she said them, that sent a jolt of electricity through him. He had expected her to be more patient, more understanding, but there was a fire in her now that he hadn't seen before. It was as if the time for talking was over, and they were both standing at the edge of something much more intense, much more real. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," he admitted, his voice betraying him. "I don't know if I can do this." Kayla's expression remained calm, but the heat in her gaze deepened. "You're already doing it," she said quietly. "Every moment you're here, every moment you stay close to me, you're already bound. The question is, what will you do with it?" Varric swallowed hard, his mind reeling. He had come here to confront the situation, to understand it, but now, in the face of her, he wasn't sure what to do next. She was standing so close to him, their bodies nearly touching, and he could feel the warmth radiating from her. The air between them was charged, as though a single touch would be enough to ignite something neither of them could control. Kayla seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the fabric of his cloak, sending a jolt of awareness through him. He stood frozen, unsure whether to pull away or lean into the touch. There was an intensity in her eyes that made his pulse quicken, a hunger he hadn't seen before. "You're afraid," Kayla said, her voice soft, almost coaxing. "And I understand that. But the more you resist, the harder it will be to accept what is already happening. The bond, it's not just about choice anymore, Varric. It's about survival. Our people depend on us." He wanted to pull back, to remind her of the boundaries that should exist between them, but he couldn't. Her touch had an undeniable pull, and despite his better judgment, despite every rational thought in his mind, he felt himself drawn to her. It was like a force he couldn't fight, something primal that refused to be ignored. "I don't know if I can be what you need," Varric said, his voice barely above a whisper. He was so close to her now that he could feel the warmth of her body, the soft scent of her skin mixing with the incense that filled the room. "I don't know if I can live up to whatever you expect." Kayla's eyes searched his face, and for a moment, there was a softness in her gaze, a vulnerability that surprised him. She took a deep breath and reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers gentle against his skin. It was a touch that sent a wave of warmth through him, and for the first time since this all began, Varric felt as though he was no longer just a man caught in a situation, but a man at the center of something far greater. "I don't expect perfection, Varric," she said quietly. "I don't need you to be someone you're not. I need you to understand that what we have is not something we can walk away from. Not anymore." The way she spoke, so calmly and yet so filled with an undeniable authority, made Varric's heart race. He didn't know what to do with the way his body reacted to her presence, to her touch. He had always been able to control his emotions, to keep them buried beneath a mask of politeness and professionalism. But here, now, standing in front of her, all of that seemed meaningless. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could find the words, Kayla took a step closer, her chest brushing against his. The closeness was electrifying, and Varric's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, neither of them moved, both of them aware of the growing tension between them. Finally, Kayla spoke again, her voice a low murmur. I'm not asking for anything more than what we already share, Varric. But if we don't confront this soon, it will be too late. Varric's head swam. The pull toward her was undeniable now, and he knew that whatever choice he made would change everything. He had come here to understand, to make sense of the situation, but now he realized the truth. There was no clear path forward, only decisions and the consequences that came with them. I'll do what I can, Varric said, his voice a little shakier than he intended. But I need more time. I can't rush into this. Kayla's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. Time is something we both have, but not much. She stepped back slightly, breaking the contact between them, but the air was still charged with the same intensity. Varric couldn't help but feel like the next time they met, they would be forced to confront what they had been avoiding. The bond was already growing stronger, and soon, neither of them would be able to ignore it. As Kayla turned to the side, her posture still commanding, Varric knew that the choice was becoming unavoidable. The question was no longer if he would accept the bond, but when, and whether he was ready for what that would mean for both of them. The following day, Varric stood at the balcony overlooking the great expanse of the city. The soft hum of life below, the chatter of the marketplace, the clatter of carts and wagons. None of it seemed to reach him. His mind was far from the bustling life outside, preoccupied instead with the conversation he had had with Kayla. The tension between them still lingered, pulling at him from every angle. He had spent the night thinking, reflecting on everything that had led him here, and on everything Kayla had said. The bond was something that couldn't be ignored, that much was clear. But the more he considered it, the more questions arose in his mind. What did it truly mean? Was it a choice at all? Was he simply being swept along by forces beyond his control? A knock at the door broke his reverie, and he turned toward it with a sense of reluctant anticipation. He knew who it was before they spoke. Varric, Kayla's voice filtered through the door. Her tone was softer than usual, almost as if she were giving him the space he needed. Yet there was an urgency beneath it that he couldn't quite ignore. He opened the door to find her standing there, her posture rigid, but there was something different about her today. Her gaze was focused, determined. She wasn't waiting for him to speak this time. Instead, she stepped into the room without a word, closing the door gently behind her. "You're here?" Varric said, though his voice sounded flat, as if he didn't know what to expect. He had told himself he needed more time, yet her presence felt inevitable, like it had always been meant to be this way. "I didn't come here to wait for you," Kayla replied, her voice low, though there was an edge to it that sent a shiver down Varric's spine. "I came because it's time to face the truth." She wasn't giving him an opening to back away, to postpone the inevitable. Varric knew, deep down, that this moment would come eventually. The choice was no longer a question of if, but when, and he couldn't avoid it any longer. Kayla moved closer, her eyes never leaving his. Despite her calm exterior, there was a fire in her. Something that pulsed beneath the surface, something that made him uneasy and yet drawn to her at the same time. She was a force he couldn't deny. "You said you needed time," Kayla continued, her words like a gentle yet insistent pull. "But you've had time, Varric. The bond has been growing stronger since we met, and you've felt it just as much as I have. It's not something that can be ignored anymore." Varric opened his mouth to respond, to argue that he still needed more time, that he wasn't ready, but the words didn't come. He could feel her presence drawing him in, and the weight of her words, the truth of what she was saying, settled heavily on his chest. He had tried to deny it, but there was no escaping it. She was right. "I know you're afraid," Kayla said softly, her voice laced with empathy. "But fear won't change what's happening between us. It's already here." Varric swallowed, the words catching in his throat. His hand gripped the edge of the balcony railing, his fingers white-knuckled from the force. He had never been one to surrender easily, never one to let go of control. But in the face of Kayla's quiet resolve, he felt something inside him begin to shift. The certainty in her eyes made him question whether this was something he had any say in at all. "I don't know what you expect of me," he finally managed, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't come here to be tied to someone else's fate." Kayla's expression softened, but her gaze didn't waver. She stepped closer, close enough that Varric could feel the warmth of her body radiating off her. Though they didn't touch, she was just out of reach, but the space between them felt almost suffocating. "I don't expect anything from you, Varric," Kayla said, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. "I don't need you to be someone you're not. I just need you to see that what we have, what's between us, is real. We can choose to embrace it or we can fight it. But either way, it's already changed everything." Varric's heart thudded in his chest, the pull of her words too strong to ignore. The quiet intimacy between them, the way she spoke to him, so direct, so calm, yet charged with an undeniable tension. It made his mind race. The bond was there, undeniable, but accepting it meant something far greater than just an agreement. It meant a shift in everything he knew about himself and his future. He had spent his life building walls, walls of control, of logic, of reason. But Kayla had shattered those walls without a word, without lifting a finger. And in their place was an openness he wasn't sure how to handle. Her eyes, bright and steady, locked with his. "You feel it too, don't you?" Varric didn't answer immediately. He wanted to deny it, to tell himself it was just some strange circumstance, some misunderstanding of their cultures. But as she stood there, her presence so undeniably real, he couldn't deny it any longer. He felt the pull, the same pull that had brought them together in the first place. "Yeah," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I feel it." A silence fell between them, heavy and charged, as though both of them were waiting for something to break. Something that would either confirm or shatter the connection between them. Varric's thoughts churned, but he couldn't find the right words to say. There was nothing left to argue against. Everything she had said made sense. Kayla stepped closer, so close now that their bodies almost touched. Varric could feel her breath against his skin, the warmth of her presence making his heart race faster. He stood motionless, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His mind screamed for him to retreat, to escape, but his body betrayed him. The pull toward her was too strong to ignore. "This is what I'm asking of you," Kayla said softly, her voice so close it sent a shiver down his spine. "Not perfection, not promises, just us, together." Varric closed his eyes for a moment, his hand tightening around the railing as he struggled to hold onto the last remnants of control. This was no longer just about politics, no longer just about duty or survival. It was about something deeper, something he couldn't understand. He opened his eyes to find Kayla still watching him, her expression calm but intent, as though she were waiting for him to make the first move. The air between them seemed to crackle with anticipation. "I need to think," he said, his voice almost a plea. "I need a little more time. This is too much." Kayla nodded, her gaze unwavering. "I'll give you time, but I can't promise how much longer I'll be able to wait." Varric nodded, though the weight of her words pressed on him. Time was slipping away, and soon they would have to face what they had both been avoiding. The bond between them was no longer something he could deny, but the question still loomed large. What would it mean for him to accept it? As Kayla stepped back, the distance between them felt like an insurmountable chasm. The pull between them hadn't diminished. If anything, it had only grown stronger. And Varric knew that, sooner or later, he would have to make a choice. A choice that would change everything. Varric spent the next several days in a fog of indecision. Every time he thought he had his emotions under control, every time he convinced himself that he had time to think, Kayla's presence would pull him right back into the whirlwind of uncertainty. Her eyes, her voice, the way she stood so confidently before him, it was impossible to ignore. The bond between them hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger, more insistent, as though it were demanding acknowledgement. Each day, he felt the weight of the choices bearing down on him. He couldn't keep running from it. No matter how much he tried to bury himself in his duties, the inevitable conclusion kept coming back to the same thing. Kayla. Her needs, her expectations, his own feelings, tangled up in ways he didn't know how to deal with. Finally, he found himself back in the courtyard where they had first met, standing in the same spot where the world had shifted under his feet. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and the distant hum of activity, but all of it felt distant. Nothing seemed real except for the pounding of his heart and the soft rustle of Kayla's approaching footsteps. When she appeared before him, he could see the same calm resolve in her eyes. It was the same quiet strength she had shown when they first met, the strength that had both unsettled and intrigued him. She was standing at the threshold of something profound, and she was inviting him to step across that line with her. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice rough with the weight of the decision. "I've thought about it constantly." Kayla nodded, not rushing him, but her eyes never leaving his. "And," Varric exhaled slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something definitive, something that would make the weight of it all feel easier. But no words seemed right. There were no clear answers, only the space between them that felt both fragile and inevitable. "I don't know what I expected," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't ask for this, but here we are." He finally met her gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes unmistakable. "What do you want from me, Kayla?" Her lips corked up into a soft, understanding smile. "I don't want anything you aren't willing to give, Varric. I only want you to see the truth." He ran a hand through his hair, tension building in his chest. "The truth," he repeated, "that this bond, this thing between us, is something we can't escape?" "Yes," Kayla said firmly. "It's a bond of our souls. It doesn't fade just because we want it to, and it's not something we can ignore anymore." Varric sighed deeply, the weight of his responsibility to both her and himself bearing down on him. It wasn't just about duty anymore. It was about choice, about what kind of person he wanted to be in the face of this overwhelming truth. "I'm not sure I'm ready," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've spent my whole life working to build something meaningful, something real. And now this bond just upends everything." Kayla took a step closer, her presence soothing yet still charged with that same intensity. "You don't have to be ready, Varric. Not all at once. We can take it slow, but you do need to acknowledge it. Acknowledge what's already here." Varric closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. She was right. The bond had already taken root between them, and the more he fought it, the harder it seemed to deny. The question was no longer whether it existed. It was what they would do with it. Would they embrace it, or would they keep pretending it wasn't there? He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze once more. This time, the conflict in his chest didn't feel so overwhelming. Instead, it felt like the first step towards something new, something he wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. Kayla had been the one to show him the possibility of this connection. Now, it was time for him to decide if he was willing to take that step with her. "I don't know if I can," he said softly, "but I'll try." Kayla's expression softened, and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through his body, but she didn't push further. She was giving him space, letting him come to his own conclusions. "I'm not asking for perfection, Varric," she said gently. "I'm just asking for honesty, and for you to be with me in this. I need you, not because of the bond, but because of you." Varric swallowed hard. Her words pierced through the fog of doubt that had clouded his mind, and for the first time, he wasn't thinking about what this would mean for him in the long term. He wasn't thinking about his duty, or what people would say, or how he could keep his own life in order. He was thinking about Kayla, about the woman standing in front of him who had shown him a side of the world he never even considered. The bond was something he had to face, and there was no turning back. But there was also something deeper, something more real than any of the politics or expectations that had always shaped his life. He had to admit to himself that he felt something for Kayla. He didn't know what it was yet, but it was real and it was powerful. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick with unspoken understanding, and the air seemed to crackle with an energy that neither of them could deny. Finally, Varric took a step closer to her, closing the distance between them. His heart was pounding, but his mind had finally quieted enough for him to hear his own thoughts. "I'm scared," he confessed, his voice low but steady. "Scared of what this means. But I'm not running anymore. I can't." Kayla's lips curved upward, and this time, the smile was filled with warmth and relief. "I'm not asking you to run, Varric. I'm asking you to stay, and to trust that we can face this together." Varric stood still for a moment, his heart beating in his chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be simple, but he knew in that moment that he wasn't alone. Kayla was here, standing by him, ready to face the unknown with him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like he had to do it all on his own. He could let go of some of the burden. He could step forward. With a slow exhale, he nodded. "Okay, let's see where this takes us." Kayla's eyes sparkled with something unspoken, but before either of them could say another word, a distant horn sounded, breaking the quiet tension that had settled between them. It was a warning, something that both of them recognized immediately. Their world was about to change yet again. "Something's happening," Varric said, his gaze flicking toward the horizon. The distant hum of energy was growing louder. The peace they had found seemed to be short-lived. The threat that loomed over them was drawing closer, and it would require them to be more than just allies. They would need to be something more. Kayla turned to face him, her expression hardening, ready for what was to come. "We'll face it together," she said firmly. Varric nodded, his heart pounding once again. This was only the beginning. The night had fallen quickly, the world around them casting deep shadows beneath the rising moon. Varric and Kayla stood at the edge of the courtyard, the distant sound of battle horns echoing through the valley. The tension in the air was palpable, a heavy weight that pressed against their chests. The peace they had fought so hard to find seemed fragile now, just one more casualty of the approaching threat. "We don't have much time," Varric said quietly, his voice edged with urgency. His hand clenched around the hilt of his sword, the familiar weight a small comfort in the face of uncertainty. "We need to prepare." Kayla nodded, her stance solid and resolute, but her eyes told a different story. Behind the calm mask, Varric could see the strain, the weight of everything they'd come to understand about each other. The bond they shared, stronger now than ever, made it impossible to ignore the way they were linked body and soul. She had become more than just an ally in this struggle. She had become someone who felt as essential to him as air, someone he couldn't bear to lose. "There's a village nearby, near the edge of the woods," Kayla said, her voice low and purposeful. "We'll need to gather the others. There's no way we can fight this alone." Varric's gaze softened as he looked at her, the raw honesty in her voice pulling at something deep inside of him. She was right. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about everyone. The lives of their people, his people, were at stake. And even though he knew his role in this conflict, knew what he had to do, there was still a part of him that dreaded the outcome. A part of him that feared the price they might pay. "I'll go," he said firmly, the decision already made in his mind. He couldn't let Kayla take on this burden alone. Not now, not ever. Kayla's eyes flickered with something that might have been hesitation, but she masked it quickly. She knew the stakes as well as he did. "We can't afford to split up, Varric. The danger is too great." "I'll be quick," he said. "We need to rally everyone who's still willing to fight. If we're going to survive this, we need every hand." She stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his arm. The touch was small but meaningful, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared in the days leading up to this moment. The bond between them had grown in ways neither of them had expected. And with every passing day, Varric realized just how much Kayla had become a part of his life, how much he needed her by his side. "I'll hold the fort," Kayla replied. Her voice was firm, yet there was an underlying softness to it that he couldn't ignore. The words were spoken with the same strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. Words that both grounded him and made his heart ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. We can't afford to be divided. Stay safe, Varric. Varric caught her hand before she could pull away, his fingers closing around hers in a gentle but firm grip. I'll return to you, I promise. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unspoken emotions. The pressure of their situation was unmistakable, but in that brief silence, Varric allowed himself to feel something different, something softer. There was a peace in knowing they were both on the same side, that despite everything they had gone through, they had found something real together. Be careful, Kayla murmured, her gaze holding his. The enemy is closing in. Don't underestimate them. Varric gave her a nod, swallowing down the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had a responsibility, both to his people and to Kayla, to ensure that they survived whatever came next. But in that moment, all he could think about was how deeply his connection to her had become rooted in his soul. She had become his anchor, the one thing he couldn't afford to lose. With a final, lingering glance, he turned and made his way toward the distant forest, his thoughts a whirlwind of strategy, battle, and the haunting fear of what might happen if he didn't return. As he walked, he could still feel the warmth of Kayla's hand against his, the memory of it pulsing through him like a steady heartbeat. The night was eerily quiet as he ventured deeper into the woods, the moon casting long, twisted shadows on the ground. The village was only a few miles away, but with every step, Varric felt a growing sense of unease. There was something in the air, an unnatural stillness that made his skin prickle. When he reached the village, the scene before him was almost too much to bear. The houses were in disarray, the faint glow of fires casting an orange hue across the rooftops. Figures moved through the streets, but there was no sound of life, no laughter, no cries of joy, only the oppressive silence that seemed to hang over everything like a shroud. Varric's heart pounded in his chest as he made his way toward the center of the village. There, he found a group of survivors huddled together, their faces pale with fear. They looked up at him with a mixture of hope and desperation, and Varric knew that their survival rested on his shoulders now. We need to move quickly, Varric said, his voice low but urgent. The enemy is coming. One of the village leaders, a tall man with graying hair, stepped forward. We're not ready, he said, his voice shaking. Our forces are scattered. We don't have enough weapons, not enough fighters. We'll make do, Varric replied, his gaze hardening. But we need to move now. There's no time to waste. The villagers hesitated, but something in Varric's tone must have struck a chord, because one by one, they gathered their things and began to move. As they left the village, Varric kept his eyes on the horizon, knowing that this was only the beginning of the battle they would soon face. The feeling in his chest didn't ease, though. He couldn't shake the unease that gnawed at him, the feeling that something was wrong, something he hadn't anticipated. He tried to shake it off, but it lingered cold and pressing. As he led the group back toward the fortress, Varric's mind kept drifting back to Kayla. He had promised to return, but with each step, the weight of that promise grew heavier. What if it wasn't enough? What if they were too late? He quickened his pace, the urgency now building inside him, a sense of dread settling over him like a storm cloud. Kayla needed him, and he had to be there, for both her and everyone else. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The coming conflict would test them all, and no matter the outcome, everything had changed. The battle had raged for hours. Varric's body ached, his muscles burning with the exertion of the fight, but his mind was sharp, focused. They had managed to hold the fortress, to fend off the first wave of attackers, but the second wave was coming, and it was only a matter of time before they would face the full force of their enemies. He didn't know if they would make it through the night. Kayla was by his side, as always. In the heat of the battle, he had not been able to keep his eyes off her. The way she moved through the chaos with ease, every step sure and purposeful. Her strength was unmatched, and Varric had always known she was a warrior. But it was the connection between them, the bond they had forged over their time together, that made everything feel more intense. Each glance, each touch between them, spoke volumes in a way words never could. It wasn't just the fight they were in together, it was everything that had led them here. He caught her eye across the battlefield, and for a split second, their gazes locked. Her face was streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were fierce, filled with determination. She gave him a small nod, a silent promise that she would hold the line, no matter what. Varric felt something stir within him, a surge of protectiveness, of affection, but he couldn't afford to focus on it now. They were in the thick of it, and every second counted. The enemy was relentless, and they were closing in on the fortress, their forces overwhelming. He motioned to his men, urging them to fall back toward the inner courtyard where the last line of defense had been set up. The sound of clashing swords, the cries of the wounded, the shouts of commands. All of it felt muffled in the storm of adrenaline that raged within him. His thoughts were all on Kayla, on the battle, and on the promise he had made to return to her. He wouldn't fail her. He couldn't. The courtyard was crowded with warriors, the air thick with smoke from the fires that had begun to spread. Varric moved through the chaos, his focus unwavering. As he reached the center, he saw Kayla at the far side, standing tall among the defenders. Her back was straight, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the next attack. Despite the bloodshed, despite the odds against them, there was something peaceful in the way she held herself, something grounded and unshakable. The enemy was upon them, a surge of bodies that came like a tidal wave, but Varric wasn't afraid. Not when Kayla was at his side. They had been through so much already, and this was just another test they would pass together. He knew it. He had to believe it. They fought side by side, their movements in perfect harmony, as though they had trained for this moment their entire lives. Varric's sword was a blur as he parried and struck, each blow a testament to the skill they had both honed through years of training. But no matter how hard they fought, it seemed like the enemy never stopped coming. For every one they felled, 3 more took their place. It was when they were pushed back to the edge of the courtyard, cornered by the relentless tide, that Varric realized just how close they were to losing everything. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands slick with sweat, his mind racing. He wouldn't let them take the fortress, but the enemy was everywhere now, closing in on all sides. His men were struggling to hold their ground, and Kayla, Varric's heart skipped a beat. He turned, searching for her among the chaos, his chest tightening. He spotted her at the far edge of the courtyard, locked in a battle with an imposing figure, her sword clashing against his with each strike. She was outnumbered. "Kayla!" he shouted, his voice lost in the clamor of battle, but she couldn't hear him. She was too focused on the fight. Panic surged through him, but he forced it back, pushing through the sea of bodies until he reached her side. Without a word, he swung his sword, cutting down the enemy soldier who had been advancing on her. Kayla glanced up at him, her eyes flickering with something between surprise and relief. Her lips parted to say something, but there was no time. The enemy was still coming. Together they fought as one, 2 warriors against the tide. It was only when the leader of the enemy forces appeared on the horizon, flanked by a dozen soldiers, that Varric realized they were facing their final stand. The man was tall, dressed in dark armor that gleamed in the moonlight, his presence commanding. His eyes locked onto Varric's, a silent challenge in his gaze. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. "Varric," Kayla breathed, her voice low as she stepped closer to him. Her hand brushed his arm, a fleeting touch, but it was enough to send a spark through him. He could see the worry in her eyes. She was just as aware of the threat as he was. "We need to end this," she said, her voice firm. Varric nodded, his grip tightening around his sword. Together, they moved toward the leader, their steps synchronized, their weapons poised for the final strike. The enemy leader smiled, a cruel, mocking grin that did nothing to shake Varric's resolve. He knew what had to be done. With one final, coordinated strike, they brought the leader to his knees. His body crumpled to the ground, the weight of their combined effort bringing an end to the battle. Silence fell over the courtyard, the last of the enemy forces retreating into the night. It was over. exhausted, covered in dirt and blood. Varric and Kayla stood in the center of the courtyard, breathing heavily. Their eyes met again, the intensity of the moment thick between them. "We made it," Kayla whispered, her voice a mixture of relief and something deeper. Something Varric couldn't quite name, but that made his heart race in his chest. Varric nodded, his gaze softening as he took a step closer to her. In that moment, with the battle won and the threat behind them, everything else fell away. The world around them seemed to disappear as they stood in the quiet aftermath, the weight of the fight still heavy on their shoulders, but the bond between them stronger than ever. "We did," he said quietly. Kayla reached out, her fingers brushing against his once more. The touch was gentle, but it spoke volumes. They didn't need words to understand each other now. And as they stood there, side by side, the night finally began to settle around them, the stars above offering a silent promise of hope, of a future that was still theirs to create.